My name is Dominic Hawthorne, and I'm a healthcare inspector who survived the first 6 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged our world into darkness, I watched Atlanta freeze solid in July while government officials abandoned us with secrets they should have shared. I had to choose between following protocols and keeping people alive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dominic Hawthorne, and I'm a healthcare inspector who survived the first 6 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged our world into darkness, I watched Atlanta freeze solid in July while government officials abandoned us with secrets they should have shared. I had to choose between following protocols and keeping people alive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I'm speaking to you from inside a barricaded government building in Atlanta, Georgia. It's been 6 days since the world changed forever, and I need to tell you this story while I still can. The heating system is failing. The temperature outside is negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and yesterday was supposed to be July 20th. What I'm about to tell you isn't just about survival. It's about the warnings we all ignored and the signs that were right in front of us. For 8 years, I worked as a senior healthcare inspector for the CDC's Southeast Regional Office. My job was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. I investigated infectious disease outbreaks, audited hospital compliance, and made sure healthcare facilities followed federal safety protocols. I specialized in the kind of work that most people never think about until something goes wrong. Containment procedures, quarantine protocols, decontamination standards. I was the guy who showed up unannounced to make sure hospitals were ready for emergencies they hoped would never come. The work made me paranoid, and I mean that in the most literal sense. After spending years investigating cover-ups, buried reports, and institutional failures, you develop an instinct for when something doesn't add up. You learn to read between the lines of official statements, to notice when bureaucrats are nervous about things they're not saying. You become suspicious of authority figures who seem too prepared for disasters they claim nobody saw coming. 3 months before the freeze began, I filed a report that still bothers me. I'd been conducting a routine inspection at a private research facility outside Atlanta, one of those places that does government contract work but keeps most of their operations classified. The facility was clean, professional, and absolutely terrified of my presence. That should have been my first warning. Most places I inspect are annoyed by surprise visits, but this place acted like I was carrying the plague. The researchers kept using phrases I'd never heard in healthcare contexts: climate intervention studies, atmospheric modification protocols, controlled environmental scenarios. When I asked for clarification, they claimed it was all theoretical research for the Department of Defense. Military applications of weather prediction, they said. Nothing that would interest a health inspector. But their biosafety procedures were designed for something much more dangerous than weather prediction. They had containment systems that would make a level 4 biolab jealous. I wrote up my concerns and submitted the report through proper channels. 2 weeks later, I received a polite letter thanking me for my thoroughness and informing me that the facility had been reclassified above my clearance level. My report was sealed, and I was reassigned to routine hospital inspections. The whole thing disappeared into the bureaucratic maze like it never happened. That should have been my second warning, but I let it go. I had other cases, other inspections, other problems to solve. The government has thousands of classified research projects, and most of them probably are exactly what they claim to be. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, reading conspiracies into perfectly normal security protocols. Then Yellowstone erupted. July 12th was a Tuesday, and I was sitting in my office reviewing inspection schedules when the news broke. Every channel was covering the same story. The Yellowstone supervolcano, dormant for over 600,000 years, had finally woken up. The initial reports were dramatic but distant. Massive explosions, ash clouds, evacuations in Wyoming and Montana. The kind of story that dominates headlines for a few days before something else takes its place. But the government's response bothered me. The press conferences were too polished, too prepared. FEMA officials were using terminology that suggested they'd been planning for this scenario for months or years. Emergency protocols were activated with suspicious efficiency. Evacuation routes that shouldn't have existed were already mapped and staffed. The whole response felt less like improvisation and more like the execution of a pre-existing plan. The media coverage focused on the immediate drama, spectacular footage of the eruption, interviews with evacuees, updates on ashfall in neighboring states. What they didn't emphasize was the scientific consensus about what comes next: volcanic winter, global cooling, crop failures, the kind of climate disruption that has historically triggered societal collapse. I spent Tuesday evening reading everything I could find about supervolcanic eruptions and their historical effects. The Tambora eruption in 1815 caused global crop failures and famine. The year without summer. Temperatures dropped worldwide, harvests failed, and hundreds of thousands of people died from starvation and disease. Yellowstone was potentially 10 times larger than Tambora. Wednesday morning, July 13th, I woke up to the first anomaly. The temperature was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. In Atlanta, in July. Anyone who's lived in Georgia knows that July mornings don't drop below 80 degrees unless there's a hurricane coming. But the sky was clear except for a faint haze that made everything look slightly orange. At the CDC office, people were making jokes about global cooling. Finally, some relief from the heat wave, they said. Maybe we won't need as much air conditioning this summer. The jokes felt forced, like everyone was trying to convince themselves that this was normal. But the emergency management division was having meetings I wasn't invited to. Closed-door sessions with federal coordinators, climate scientists, and agricultural specialists. I tried to access some of the climate modeling data through my government clearance, but most of it was restricted above my level. What I could see was concerning enough. Atmospheric particulate projections, solar radiation reduction estimates, temperature modeling that showed sustained global cooling lasting months or years, the kind of data that suggested this wasn't a temporary weather disruption. Thursday morning, July 14th, the sky was wrong. Not just hazy or orange, but fundamentally different. The sun looked dimmer, more distant, like it was shining through layers of gauze. The automatic streetlights came on at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. People were taking pictures of the beautiful sunset that was happening 6 hours early. I had a routine inspection scheduled at Grady Hospital, one of Atlanta's major medical centers. These surprise visits were standard procedure, designed to ensure that facilities maintained proper emergency preparedness at all times. I'd inspected Grady dozens of times over the years, and they were usually well prepared but never happy to see me. This time was different. The staff seemed genuinely glad I was there, like my presence validated something they were already doing. They were implementing cold weather protocols. In July, in Georgia. When I asked about it, they said they'd received guidance from federal health services about preparing for unseasonable weather events. They were stocking extra blankets, checking heating systems, and reviewing hypothermia treatment procedures. The head nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at Grady for 20 years, pulled me aside during the inspection. She said the hospital had received calls from colleagues in Montana and Wyoming, describing injuries they'd never seen before. Severe frostbite in July, hypothermia in people who should have been dealing with heat exhaustion, respiratory problems from inhaling volcanic ash, the kind of cases that suggested the eruption's effects were already spreading far beyond the immediate impact zone. By Thursday evening, the temperature had dropped to 50 degrees. People were wearing jackets and long pants, posting on social media about the crazy weather. Local meteorologists were struggling to explain what they were seeing. Their models couldn't account for the rapid cooling. The National Weather Service was issuing conflicting reports, some predicting a return to normal temperatures, others warning of continued cooling. I remember standing in the hospital parking lot at 6 o'clock that evening, finishing up my inspection paperwork, when I saw the first snowflakes. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but definitely snow. In Atlanta, in July. The nurses inside were pressed against the windows, pointing and laughing like it was some kind of miracle. Nobody was taking it seriously yet. It was just weird weather, a freak occurrence that would make for interesting conversation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what the government had been preparing for. The too smooth emergency responses, the pre-positioned resources, the classified research I'd stumbled across 3 months earlier. Everything felt connected in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I drove home through streets where people were still acting like this was all temporary. Restaurants were open, stores were busy, kids were playing outside in the unseasonably cool weather. The city was functioning normally except for the orange sky and the impossible temperature. It felt like the calm before a storm that nobody wanted to acknowledge was coming. Friday morning, July 15th, I woke up to a world that had changed, overnight. The temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. There was snow on my car, snow on the roads, snow covering everything in a thin white layer that looked like powdered sugar scattered across summer. My neighbor was standing in his driveway, staring at his thermometer like it was broken. He looked at me and said it was probably just a freak storm, that everything would be back to normal by afternoon. But I knew better. This wasn't weather. This was the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. The volcanic ash was blocking enough sunlight to trigger rapid global cooling. The climate models I'd glimpsed at the CDC were becoming reality faster than anyone had predicted, and somewhere in a classified research facility, scientists who'd been studying this exact scenario were probably implementing protocols that the rest of us had never been told about. I made the decision that would determine everything that followed. Instead of evacuating south like most of Atlanta seemed to be attempting, I drove to the CDC regional office. If this was the beginning of a climate catastrophe, I needed to understand what the government knew and when they'd known it. I needed access to the real data, the classified reports, the emergency protocols that weren't being shared with the public. The drive to the CDC took twice as long as usual. The roads were clogged with traffic heading south on Interstate 75 and Interstate 85. People were fleeing Atlanta like refugees, loading their cars with everything they could carry. Gas stations had lines wrapped around the block. The electronic highway signs were flashing warnings about icy conditions and reduced visibility. When I arrived at the CDC building, the parking lot was almost empty. A facility that normally housed over 200 employees looked abandoned. The security guards at the entrance seemed relieved to see someone with proper credentials. They told me that most of the senior staff had been relocated to secure facilities, and only essential personnel were maintaining basic operations. Inside, I found 12 other people scattered across multiple floors of empty offices, a few emergency coordinators, some IT specialists keeping the computer systems running, and security personnel who'd been told to maintain the building until further notice. Everyone looked at me like I might have answers they didn't have. Like my inspector credentials meant I understood what was happening better than they did. The first thing I did was access the restricted weather data I'd been blocked from seeing earlier in the week. What I found confirmed my worst fears. The Yellowstone eruption had injected massive amounts of sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere, enough to reduce global solar radiation by 10 to 15%. The climate models showed sustained cooling lasting anywhere from 2 to 5 years, with the most severe effects occurring in the first 6 months, but buried in the technical reports were references to studies I'd never heard of. Project Volcanic Winter, Solar Radiation Management Research, Atmospheric Intervention Protocols. The same kind of language I'd encountered at that research facility 3 months earlier. It was becoming clear that this disaster wasn't entirely unexpected. Some part of the government had been studying volcanic winter scenarios for years. The truly disturbing part was how prepared certain agencies seemed to be. FEMA had pre-positioned cold weather supplies in locations that made no sense for July. The Department of Agriculture had quietly increased grain reserves over the past year. The Defense Department had activated Arctic warfare training programs that had been dormant since the Cold War. Someone had been getting ready for this. As I dug deeper into the classified files, I started to piece together a picture that made me sick to my stomach. The research facility I'd inspected wasn't just studying climate intervention. They were part of a network of institutions researching solar radiation management, atmospheric modification, and controlled climate manipulation. The kind of research that might make volcanic winter effects worse rather than better. My buried, Report from 3 months earlier was connected to researchers who'd been trying to warn about atmospheric instability. Scientists who'd argued that certain climate intervention experiments could amplify the effects of natural disasters like volcanic eruptions. Their warnings had been classified, their research had been redirected, and their concerns had been buried in the same bureaucratic maze that had swallowed my inspection report. By Friday afternoon, it was clear that Atlanta's infrastructure was beginning to fail. The power grid was struggling with unprecedented demand for heating. Hospitals were switching to backup generators. Water treatment facilities were dealing with frozen pipes they'd never been designed to handle. The city was being overwhelmed by a crisis it had never imagined possible, and we were just getting started. The 12 of us remaining in the CDC building spent Friday evening trying to establish contact with other government facilities, other survivor groups, other sources of information about what was happening beyond Atlanta. The news was uniformly bad. Chicago was completely dark. Denver was buried under 10 feet of snow. Phoenix was reporting temperatures below freezing for the first time in recorded history. The radio chatter was filled with desperate voices calling for help, reporting casualties, describing scenes of chaos and confusion. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Transportation networks had collapsed. Supply chains that had taken decades to build were failing within days. And through it all, I kept thinking about that research facility and the classified documents I'd found. About government officials who seemed too prepared for this disaster. About the possibility that some of this catastrophe could have been prevented if the right people had been willing to listen to the right warnings. As night fell on July 15th, with the temperature dropping toward 20 degrees and the power grid flickering across Atlanta, I realized that my job had fundamentally changed. I was no longer a health inspector conducting routine audits. I was a survivor in the opening days of a global catastrophe, and the skills that had made me good at finding institutional failures were about to become essential for keeping people alive. The orange glow outside the windows was getting dimmer, and tomorrow would bring challenges none of us were fully prepared for. The 13 of us who remained in the CDC building that Friday night had no idea we were about to become the core of something much larger. We were just people who'd made the choice to stay when everyone else was running. Emergency coordinators, Janet Mills and Robert Chen, IT specialists, Marcus Webb and Lisa Park, security guards Thomas Rivera and Sarah Johnson, maintenance supervisor Carl Washington, and 5 others whose names I'd learned to depend on over the coming days. We were a random collection of government employees who'd suddenly become responsible for each other's survival. The building's emergency protocols kicked in as the temperature continued dropping. Backup generators hummed to life as the main power grid struggled with unprecedented demand across the city. Our communications equipment stayed online while civilian networks began failing. The irony wasn't lost on me that we had better access to information about the disaster precisely because we were trapped inside a government facility. I spent the first few hours accessing every piece of classified data my clearance would allow. The satellite imagery was the most shocking part. The ash plume from Yellowstone stretched across the entire North American continent, a gray mass that looked like a cancer growing across the atmosphere. Real-time measurements showed sulfur dioxide concentrations in the stratosphere that were beyond anything in recorded history. The sun's radiation reaching Earth's surface had been reduced by 12% in just 3 days. But what really disturbed me were the references to studies I kept finding buried in the technical reports. Project Volcanic Winter wasn't just theoretical research. It was an active program that had been running for over 5 years, with multiple research facilities conducting experiments on atmospheric modification and climate intervention. The facility I'd inspected 3 months earlier was just one node in a much larger network of institutions studying how to manipulate global climate systems. The more I read, the more convinced I became that some government officials had not only known this could happen, but had been actively preparing for it. Strategic grain reserves had been quietly increased over the past 18 months. Cold weather gear had been pre-positioned in locations that made no sense for summer emergency response. Military units had been conducting Arctic warfare training, exercises that seemed completely disconnected from any known threat assessment. Someone had been getting ready for volcanic winter, and they hadn't bothered to warn the rest of us. Marcus Webb, one of our IT specialists, managed to maintain contact, with other CDC facilities across the country. The reports coming in were uniformly catastrophic. The Chicago office had lost power completely. Miami was reporting unprecedented energy demand as air conditioning systems struggled to maintain normal temperatures. Los Angeles was dealing with respiratory emergencies from volcanic ash inhalation, but it was the reports from smaller cities that really scared me. Places like Birmingham, Nashville, and Charlotte were completely unprepared for rapid temperature drops. Their infrastructure was failing faster than major metropolitan areas because they had fewer backup systems. Emergency services were being overwhelmed by calls they'd never been trained to handle. Hypothermia cases in July, frostbite injuries in the American South, medical emergencies that shouldn't exist in summer. Janet Mills had worked emergency coordination for 15 years, and she'd never seen anything like the cascade of system failures we were witnessing. The power grid wasn't just struggling with increased demand. It was dealing with physical damage from rapid temperature changes. Transformers were failing. Power lines were snapping under ice loads they'd never been designed to handle, and backup systems were being activated in sequences that had never been tested. The interstate highway system was collapsing even faster than the power grid. Interstate 75 and Interstate 85, the major evacuation routes heading south, were becoming parking lots of abandoned vehicles. Gas stations ran out of fuel within hours as hundreds of thousands of people tried to flee Atlanta simultaneously. The Georgia Department of Transportation was reporting accidents and breakdowns faster than emergency services could respond. Robert Chen was monitoring emergency radio frequencies, and the chatter was getting more desperate by the hour. Police departments were requesting assistance they couldn't get. Fire departments were dealing with calls about people trapped in buildings without heat. Hospitals were activating disaster protocols for a disaster nobody had planned for. Around 10 o'clock Friday night, we lost contact with Federal Emergency Management Headquarters in Washington. Not a communication failure, but a deliberate shutdown. The last message we received was instructions to maintain current operations and await further orders. No timeline, no additional resources, no information about when normal operations might resume. That was when I realized we were truly on our own. Sarah Johnson, our head of security, suggested we establish a watch schedule and secure the building for an extended stay. The CDC facility was designed to operate independently during biological emergencies, with backup power, water reserves, and enough emergency supplies to support essential personnel for weeks. But it was designed for a skeleton crew, not for the kind of extended isolation we were facing. I volunteered for the first watch, partly because I couldn't sleep and partly because I wanted to continue reviewing the classified files while I had access. The building felt enormous and empty with just 13 people scattered across multiple floors. Every small sound echoed in ways that made me jumpy. Outside, Atlanta was going dark section by section as the power grid continued failing. The documents I found during that first night watch changed everything I thought I knew about our situation. Hidden in subdirectories I almost missed were files labeled Operation Arctic Dawn and Controlled Climate Response Protocols. These weren't theoretical studies. They were operational plans for managing societal response to rapid climate change events. The plans assumed that volcanic winter scenarios would trigger massive population displacement, infrastructure collapse, and social instability. They outlined strategies for maintaining government continuity, while civilian populations dealt with the consequences. Strategic resource allocation, communication management, and population control measures that were designed to preserve essential government functions while allowing non-essential populations to fend for themselves. Reading those documents, I finally understood why the government response had seemed so prepared and so inadequate at the same time. They were prepared to protect themselves. They were not prepared to protect us. The most disturbing part was how the plans addressed information management, public communication strategies designed to minimize panic while maximizing government control, protocols for restricting access to accurate climate data, guidelines for managing media coverage, to prevent widespread social unrest. They had planned for this disaster, but their plans assumed that keeping people ignorant would be more effective than keeping them informed. Around 2 a.m, I found references to the research facility I'd inspected 3 months earlier. It wasn't just part of the Climate Intervention Research Network. It was one of the primary centers for developing countermeasures to volcanic winter effects, solar radiation management, atmospheric cleaning technologies, controlled warming protocols, technologies that could theoretically mitigate the effects of volcanic cooling. But, according to the documents, these countermeasures had been deemed too expensive and too risky for widespread deployment. Instead, the government had decided to focus on protecting essential personnel and infrastructure, while allowing the disaster to run its course for the general population. They had solutions they weren't implementing because they'd calculated that natural population reduction would be more cost-effective than technological intervention. I was reading about my own government's decision to let people die when Thomas Rivera shook me awake at dawn. I'd fallen asleep at the computer, and the temperature outside had dropped to 15 degrees. Through the windows, Atlanta looked like a different city. Ice covered everything. Abandoned cars were scattered across frozen roads, and smoke was rising from multiple locations where emergency heating had probably caused fires. Saturday morning brought our first real crisis. Carl Washington, our maintenance supervisor, reported that the building's primary heating system was showing signs of strain. The backup generators were running efficiently, but they weren't designed to power heating systems at full capacity for extended periods. We were using fuel faster than anticipated, and our reserves wouldn't last more than 2 weeks at current consumption rates. That was when we got the emergency call from Grady Hospital. Patricia, the head nurse I'd spoken with during my inspection, just 2 days earlier reached us through emergency radio channels. The hospital's backup generators were failing. They had over 200 patients, including dozens in intensive care, and they were losing power section by section. Internal temperatures were dropping toward dangerous levels, and they needed immediate assistance. The call forced us to make our first major decision as a group. We could stay in our secure building and preserve our resources, or we could risk our safety to help people who were in immediate danger. It was the kind of choice that defines who you are when everything else has been stripped away. I found myself arguing for the rescue mission, using my knowledge of Grady's layout and emergency systems to make the case that we could help without catastrophic risk to ourselves. But the real argument was moral. If we were going to survive this disaster, we needed to decide what kind of people we wanted to be when it was over. The vote was unanimous. We would attempt to rescue as many people from Grady as our resources allowed. Preparing for our first venture outside the CDC building was like preparing for a mission to another planet. The city we'd known just days earlier had been transformed into an Arctic environment that could kill us within minutes if we made mistakes. Carl Washington and Thomas Rivera worked together to modify our government vehicles for extreme cold conditions. Sarah Johnson organized emergency supplies and communication equipment. Janet Mills coordinated with Patricia to plan the evacuation sequence. The journey from the CDC to Grady Hospital was less than 3 miles, but it took us over an hour to navigate. Roads that had been cleared 2 days earlier were now impassable ice sheets. Abandoned vehicles created obstacle courses that required careful maneuvering. Power lines had fallen across streets and traffic signals were completely dark. But the most disturbing part was the silence. Atlanta is never quiet. Even at night, there's always traffic, sirens, the hum of urban activity. Now the city was tomb silent except for the sound of our vehicles and the occasional crack of ice-covered trees breaking under the weight. Grady Hospital was a fortress of light in a darkening city, but it was a fortress under siege. Emergency lighting created eerie shadows in hallways that should have been brightly lit. Staff members were wearing winter coats indoors. Patients were bundled under every available blanket, and their breath was visible in the air. Patricia met us at the emergency entrance, and her relief was obvious. The hospital had been dealing with a crisis that was beyond their emergency planning. Hypothermia cases were overwhelming their treatment capacity. Elderly patients were particularly vulnerable to the rapid temperature changes, and they were running out of fuel for their generators faster than they'd calculated. Working with the hospital staff, we managed to evacuate 43 people. Patients who could be safely moved, staff members whose families had already evacuated, and essential personnel who would be more useful at our CDC facility than trapped in a failing hospital. It was brutal triage, choosing who could be saved and who would have to remain behind, but it was necessary. The return journey was even more difficult with vehicles full of evacuees. Some of the people we'd rescued were in serious medical condition. Others were psychologically traumatized by what they'd witnessed over the past few days. All of them were depending on us to keep them alive in a situation none of us had been trained for. By Saturday evening, our group had grown from 13 to 56 people. The CDC building, which had felt empty with just the original staff, now felt crowded and chaotic. We had medical personnel, government employees, hospital patients, and civilians who'd been caught in the wrong place when the disaster began. We had people with useful skills and people who were completely dependent on others for survival. Managing this larger group required organizing systems we'd never needed before. Food distribution, medical care, security protocols, work assignments, and resource allocation. I found myself taking on leadership responsibilities I'd never wanted, partly because of my government clearance and partly because people seemed to trust my judgment in crisis situations. But the most important thing we gained from the Grady rescue was information. Patricia and her medical staff had been treating patients from across Atlanta, and they'd seen the full scope of what was happening to the city. Infrastructure failures were accelerating. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Most importantly, they'd been in contact with other hospitals and medical facilities, giving us a broader picture of the regional disaster. The reports were uniformly bad. Augusta was completely isolated by ice storms. Savannah was dealing with unprecedented cold that was killing tropical vegetation and disrupting the port. Macon had lost power completely. Columbus was reporting social unrest as supplies ran out and temperatures continued dropping. But we also learned that other survivor groups were forming across the region. Medical facilities, government buildings, schools, and community centers were becoming refuges for people who couldn't evacuate. We weren't alone, but we were part of a much larger catastrophe than we'd initially understood. Saturday night brought another major revelation. Marcus Webb managed to reestablish contact with a CDC facility in Denver, and their report was terrifying. The city was buried under 10 feet of snow, with temperatures reaching -30 degrees. But more importantly, they'd been in contact with government officials who were implementing the Operation Arctic Dawn protocols I'd read about. Federal emergency management was triaging entire cities. Resources were being directed to locations deemed strategically essential, while other areas were being written off as unsalvageable. The government was making calculated decisions about which populations were worth saving and which were expendable. Denver had been classified as non-essential because its population was too large to support with available resources. Federal authorities had evacuated key personnel and abandoned the rest of the city to fend for itself. The CDC facility there was operating independently, just like we were, because they'd been excluded from official rescue operations. That was when I realized that our situation wasn't temporary. We weren't waiting for federal assistance that would eventually arrive. We were part of a population that had been deliberately sacrificed by our own government to preserve resources for areas they considered more important. The knowledge was liberating and terrifying at the same time. We were free to make our own decisions because nobody in authority cared whether we survived. But we were also completely responsible for our own survival, because nobody else was coming to help us. As I took the late watch Saturday night, monitoring communications and reviewing our resource situation, I started thinking about the long-term implications of what we were facing. This wasn't a temporary emergency that would be resolved in weeks or months. Volcanic winter could last for years. The infrastructure damage we were witnessing would take decades to repair. The social and economic disruption would reshape civilization in ways we couldn't predict. We weren't just trying to survive a disaster. We were living through the end of the world we'd known and the beginning of something completely different. The radio chatter from other survivor groups told the same story. People who'd started the week as normal citizens were now making life and death decisions about resource allocation, population management, and community survival. Teachers were becoming military commanders. Store managers were becoming supply coordinators. Accountants were becoming medical triage officers. Everyone was being forced to become someone they'd never planned to be. Around 3 in the morning, I intercepted a government communication that changed everything I thought I knew about our situation. It wasn't meant for civilian reception, but our equipment was sophisticated enough to pick up encrypted federal channels. The message was brief and bureaucratic, but its implications were enormous. Strategic resource allocation had been completed for the Southeast region. Essential government facilities had been identified and supplied. Non-essential populations had been classified for natural reduction management. Federal authorities were implementing Phase 2 protocols, which involved complete withdrawal of government services from designated areas. Atlanta had been classified as a natural reduction zone. We weren't just abandoned, we were expendable by design. The government message I'd intercepted confirmed our worst fears, but it also clarified our situation in ways that were almost helpful. We weren't waiting for rescue because rescue wasn't coming. We weren't preserving resources for a temporary emergency because this emergency had no defined endpoint. We were completely on our own, which meant we were completely free to make whatever decisions we thought would keep us alive. Sunday morning, July 17th, brought us face to face with the reality of our new existence. The temperature had dropped to -5 degrees Fahrenheit, and our building's heating system was struggling to maintain safe internal temperatures. We'd been calculating fuel consumption based on normal winter heating loads, but nothing about our situation was normal. The extreme cold was forcing our generators to work harder than their designed capacity. Carl Washington delivered the news that changed everything about our timeline. At current consumption rates, we had maybe 10 days of fuel remaining, maybe less if the external temperature continued dropping. The building's insulation was designed for Georgia winters, not for Arctic conditions that could last for months or years. We had 56 people depending on heat to survive, and our heat was running out faster than we'd planned. Janet Mills suggested we could ration heating to extend our fuel supply, but the medical personnel from Grady made it clear that wouldn't work. We had elderly evacuees who wouldn't survive prolonged exposure to cold. We had patients with compromised immune systems who needed stable temperatures. We had people who were already showing early signs of hypothermia-related health problems. The choice was simple and brutal. We could stay in the building and watch people die slowly as we ran out of fuel, or we could risk everyone's lives attempting to find a more sustainable shelter before our resources were completely exhausted. I found myself arguing for evacuation, partly because staying felt like giving up and partly because I'd been studying Atlanta's infrastructure long enough to know where we might find better options. Schools built in the last 20 years had more efficient heating systems and better insulation. Some government facilities had larger fuel reserves. Community centers and churches often had backup heating systems that could operate independently. But the real argument for leaving was psychological. Sitting in the CDC building waiting for our fuel to run out was passive suicide. Moving to find better shelter was active survival. Even if the journey was dangerous, it gave us agency in our own fate. The debate continued through Sunday morning, but it was interrupted by an emergency radio call that forced our hand. Patricia was monitoring medical frequencies when she picked up a distress signal from Northside Hospital. Their backup power had failed completely, and they had critical patients who would die without immediate intervention. The call came from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the chief of emergency medicine, and her desperation was obvious even through radio static. They had premature infants in incubators, dialysis patients who needed power for life support, and surgery patients in recovery who couldn't be moved safely. The hospital's engineering staff estimated they had maybe 6 hours before the building became uninhabitable. Northside Hospital was 8 miles from our location, a journey that would require multiple vehicles and several hours in increasingly dangerous conditions. We'd be risking the lives of everyone in our group to attempt a rescue that might not succeed. But Dr. Martinez was describing patients who would definitely die without help. The vote this time wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. We would attempt the rescue, but we'd also use the mission as an opportunity to evacuate our current location. If we were going to risk everything anyway, we might as well search for better long-term shelter while we were mobile. Preparing for the Northside rescue was more complex than our previous mission to Grady. We needed to move our entire population, not just a rescue team. We needed to transport medical equipment, emergency supplies, and personal belongings that people couldn't afford to lose. Most importantly, we needed to identify potential shelter locations along our route and develop backup plans if the primary mission failed. Marcus Webb had been monitoring civilian radio frequencies, and he'd compiled a list of other survivor groups across the metropolitan area. Some were holed up in shopping centers with reliable backup power. Others had taken over schools or community centers with good heating systems. A few had organized around religious institutions with strong community networks and emergency supplies. The most promising option was Brookhaven Elementary School, a facility built just 5 years earlier with energy-efficient systems and solar backup power. It was located roughly halfway between our current position and Northside Hospital, making it a logical stopping point regardless of how the rescue mission developed. Sarah Johnson organized our convoy using every operational vehicle we could find in the CDC parking garage: government SUVs, maintenance trucks, and a small bus that had been used for employee transportation. Each vehicle was loaded with supplies, passengers, and emergency equipment. We established radio communication protocols and backup rendezvous points in case the convoy got separated. The journey through frozen Atlanta was like traveling through a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Streets that had been busy commercial corridors just days earlier were now obstacle courses of abandoned vehicles, fallen power lines, and ice-covered debris. Traffic signals were dark, street signs were obscured by ice, and familiar landmarks were transformed beyond recognition. But the most disturbing part was the evidence of human desperation we encountered along the way. Homes with broken windows, where people had apparently tried to burn furniture for heat. Cars that had been abandoned with doors open and belongings scattered on the ground. Signs of looting at stores that had never been designed to withstand determined break-in attempts. We also saw other survivor groups, and not all of them seemed friendly. At one intersection, we encountered a roadblock that had been constructed from shopping carts and concrete barriers. Armed individuals were checking vehicles and demanding tolls for passage. We managed to negotiate safe transit by trading medical supplies, but the encounter made it clear that social order was breaking down faster than physical infrastructure. Brookhaven Elementary School exceeded our hopes in almost every way. The building was structurally sound, well-insulated, and equipped with backup heating systems that were still operational. The solar panels on the roof were generating enough power to support basic lighting and communication equipment. Most importantly, the facility was already occupied by a group of 37 survivors who seemed organized and welcoming. The school's principal, Maria Santos, had stayed with her custodial staff and several families from the neighborhood when the evacuation orders came through. They'd been managing the facility as an impromptu community center, using the cafeteria for food distribution and the gymnasium for general assembly meetings. They'd established security protocols, work assignments, and resource management systems that were more sophisticated than anything we'd developed. What impressed me most was their planning horizon. While we'd been focused on immediate survival, they'd been thinking about long-term sustainability. They'd inventoried local resources, established contact with other survivor groups, and developed strategies for maintaining their community through extended cold weather. But they also needed what we could provide: medical expertise, government, equipment, and access to classified information about the scope of the disaster. The merger made sense for everyone involved, creating a community of nearly 100 people with diverse skills and resources. The integration process took most of Sunday afternoon, but it was interrupted by our obligation to continue the rescue mission to Northside Hospital. Dr. Martinez had been broadcasting increasingly desperate updates throughout the day. The hospital's internal temperature was dropping toward dangerous levels, and they were losing patients to hypothermia and equipment failure. I led a smaller team to complete the Northside rescue while the majority of our group worked on establishing our new community at Brookhaven Elementary. The hospital situation was worse than we'd expected. Dr. Martinez and her staff had been working without adequate heat for over 18 hours. Several patients had already died, and others were in critical condition. The rescue operation became a massive medical evacuation. We transported 22 patients and 15 medical staff members back to Brookhaven, using every vehicle in our convoy and improvising medical support systems along the way. Dr. Martinez brought portable medical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, and expertise that immediately improved our community's healthcare capabilities. But the most valuable thing we gained from the Northside rescue was information about conditions across the broader metropolitan area. Dr. Martinez had been in contact with other hospitals and medical facilities throughout the weekend, giving her a comprehensive picture of infrastructure collapse and survival efforts. The reports confirmed that we were part of a much larger pattern of abandonment. Federal emergency management had evacuated essential personnel from strategic facilities while leaving civilian populations to manage on their own. Military bases had been stripped of non-essential personnel. Government offices had been closed indefinitely. Even major hospitals had been classified as non-essential if they weren't located in areas deemed strategically important. Atlanta, with its population of over 6 million people in the metropolitan area, had been written off as unsustainable under volcanic winter conditions. The government had calculated that supporting such a large civilian population would require resources that were needed elsewhere. Sunday evening at Brookhaven Elementary felt like the beginning of something entirely new. We had nearly 100 people organized into functional work groups, medical care coordinated by Dr. Martinez and Patricia, security managed by Sarah Johnson and several volunteers with military or police experience, resource management handled by Maria Santos and Janet Mills, technical support provided by Marcus Webb and the IT specialists. But most importantly, we had a planning committee that was thinking beyond immediate survival. Carl Washington and the maintenance staff were evaluating the school's infrastructure for long-term occupation. Teachers and education specialists were organizing activities for children in the group. People with agricultural knowledge were discussing food production strategies for spring planting. The psychological shift was enormous. Instead of feeling like refugees waiting for rescue, we were beginning to feel like colonists establishing a new community. The difference was crucial for morale and long-term planning. However, our expanded community also brought new challenges and responsibilities. 100 people consume resources much faster than 56 people. We needed more food, more fuel, more medical supplies, and more security than our original group had required. The logistics of managing such a large population in an emergency situation were complex and demanding. More importantly, we were no longer invisible. A group of 100 people generates more radio traffic, requires more supply runs, and attracts more attention from other survivor groups. Some of that attention might be positive, from communities interested in trade or cooperation, but some of it might be negative, from groups that saw us as competition for limited resources. Monday morning, July 18th, brought our first serious external threat. Marcus Webb intercepted radio communications indicating that a large group of survivors had taken control of the Lenox Square shopping mall and were demanding tribute from smaller communities in exchange for protection. They had apparently organized themselves along military lines, with armed patrols and aggressive resource acquisition strategies. The mall group had superior numbers and weapons, but they were also consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. They were likely to expand their territorial claims as their supplies diminished, which meant they would eventually demand access to our resources or our facility. This was exactly the kind of threat that government emergency planners had anticipated when they developed the natural reduction protocols I'd read about. Large populations competing for limited resources, social breakdown, and the emergence of militarized survivor groups that could destabilize entire regions. But it was also an opportunity to test our community's decision-making processes and resolve. Maria Santos called a general assembly to discuss our response options. We could try to avoid contact with the mall group, attempt to negotiate some kind of accommodation, or prepare for potential conflict. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about the kind of community we wanted to build. Some people argued for aggressive defense and preemptive action. Others advocated for diplomatic engagement and resource sharing. Still others suggested we should relocate to avoid confrontation entirely. I found myself advocating for a middle course based on intelligence gathering and defensive preparation. We needed to understand the mall group's capabilities and intentions before committing to any particular strategy. But we also needed to demonstrate that we weren't easy targets while remaining open to peaceful coexistence if that was possible. The decision was made to establish better security protocols while simultaneously reaching out to other survivor communities in the area. If we were going to face threats from organized groups, we needed allies and information networks that could help us respond effectively. Monday afternoon brought another piece of disturbing news. Dr. Martinez had been monitoring medical radio frequencies and picked up reports of disease outbreaks in several survivor communities. Respiratory infections, gastrointestinal problems, and what sounded like early stages of malnutrition-related illnesses were spreading among populations that lacked adequate medical care and sanitation facilities. The volcanic ash in the atmosphere wasn't just blocking sunlight and cooling the climate. It was also creating respiratory health problems for people who couldn't avoid extended exposure. Emergency shelters that lacked proper air filtration were becoming breeding grounds for infectious diseases that could spread rapidly through stressed populations. Our medical team immediately implemented enhanced sanitation protocols and began screening community members for early signs of illness. But the broader implications were terrifying. Disease outbreaks could destabilize survivor communities faster than resource shortages or external threats. This was another aspect of the natural reduction protocols that government planners had anticipated. They'd calculated that disease and malnutrition would significantly reduce civilian populations during the first winter, making resource allocation problems more manageable for surviving communities. Reading between the lines of the classified documents I'd accessed, it was clear that federal authorities expected mortality rates of 60 to 70% among non-essential populations during the first year of volcanic winter. They weren't just abandoning us, they were counting on most of us to die. Monday evening brought a breakthrough in our understanding of the broader situation. Marcus Webb managed to establish contact with a ham radio operator in Birmingham who'd been coordinating information sharing among survivor communities across the Southeast. His reports painted a picture of widespread infrastructure collapse and social reorganization that extended far beyond our local area. Every major city in the region was dealing with similar problems: power grid failures, transportation network collapse, communication system breakdowns, and the emergence of small survivor communities trying to maintain some semblance of civilization. But there were also examples of successful adaptation and cooperation. Some communities had established trade networks for sharing resources and information. Others had developed specialized roles, with agricultural areas focusing on food production, and urban areas concentrating on manufacturing and technical services. A few had even begun planning for coordinated regional recovery efforts. The most encouraging news was that federal authorities weren't the only ones who'd been preparing for this kind of disaster. Academic institutions, religious organizations, and community groups had also developed emergency plans and resource stockpiles. Some of these preparations were proving more effective than government programs because they'd been designed to support civilian populations rather than just preserve official authority. But the most important thing we learned was that we weren't alone in recognizing the long-term implications of what we were facing. Survivor communities across the region were beginning to think beyond immediate crisis management toward building sustainable societies that could function independently of federal support. Tuesday morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities to test everything we'd learned about survival and community building. The temperature was continuing to drop, our resource situation remained precarious, and external threats were becoming more sophisticated and dangerous. But we were no longer the same group of people who'd been trapped in the CDC building just 4 days earlier. We'd become something stronger, more resilient, and more capable of adapting to whatever came next. Tuesday morning, July 19th, began with what seemed like good news but turned into our most dangerous challenge yet. The temperature had stabilized at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant the rapid cooling trend might be leveling off. Our heating systems were managing to maintain comfortable internal temperatures, and our fuel consumption had decreased slightly as we'd optimized our energy usage patterns. But the apparent stability was deceptive. Marcus Webb had been monitoring atmospheric data through government satellite feeds that were still accessible with our equipment, and the readings were disturbing. The volcanic ash concentration in the upper atmosphere was actually increasing, not decreasing. More eruptions were occurring at Yellowstone, smaller than the initial blast, but still significant enough to pump additional particulates into the stratosphere. What we were experiencing wasn't the worst of the volcanic winter. It was just the beginning. The satellite imagery showed ash plumes spreading across the entire northern hemisphere, with concentrations so dense that solar radiation was being reduced by nearly 20% in some areas. Climate models that had initially predicted 6 months to 2 years of cooling were being revised upward. Some projections now suggested 3 to 5 years of significantly reduced global temperatures. Dr. Martinez had been reviewing medical literature about historical volcanic winters, and her findings were sobering. The Tambora eruption of 1815 had caused global famine, disease outbreaks, and social collapse that lasted for nearly a decade. The year without summer had triggered massive population displacement, agricultural failure, and political instability across multiple continents. Yellowstone was potentially 10 times more powerful than Tambora, and we were living in a much more complex and interdependent society than existed in the early 19th century. The cascading effects of infrastructure failure, supply chain collapse, and social disruption could last for decades. Our community of nearly 100 people was adapting well to immediate survival challenges, but we weren't prepared for the long-term implications of what we were facing. We needed to start thinking about sustainable food production, permanent shelter construction, and social organization that could function independently for years rather than months. The morning planning session was interrupted by an emergency radio call from a group calling themselves the Peachtree Alliance. They claimed to represent several survivor communities in the northern suburbs and wanted to establish contact with other organized groups in the Atlanta area. Their radio operator, someone who identified himself as Colonel James Wright, requested a meeting to discuss mutual cooperation and resource sharing. The call was both encouraging and suspicious. Encouraging because it suggested that larger-scale organization was emerging among survivor communities. Suspicious because the military language and formal protocols suggested a level of pre-planning that seemed unusual for a civilian group that had supposedly formed spontaneously after the disaster. Sarah Johnson was particularly concerned about the military overtones of the contact. Her security background had taught her to be cautious about groups that seemed too well organized or too eager to establish relationships with other communities. In her experience, people who moved quickly to consolidate control were often planning to exploit rather than cooperate. But Maria Santos argued that we needed allies if we were going to survive long-term challenges. Our community had valuable resources and skills, but we were still vulnerable to larger, more aggressive groups. Building relationships with other organized communities could provide mutual defense and resource-sharing opportunities that would benefit everyone involved. The debate reflected a fundamental tension in our community between security concerns and cooperation needs. We were strong enough to be independent, but not strong enough to ignore external threats. We had resources that others wanted, but not enough resources to survive without external support. I found myself advocating for cautious engagement. We should respond to the Peachtree Alliance contact, but gather intelligence about their capabilities and intentions before committing to any formal agreements. We needed to understand who they were, what they wanted, and whether their offer of cooperation was genuine or a prelude to more aggressive demands. The decision was made to send a small delegation to meet with Peachtree Alliance representatives at a neutral location. I would lead the group, accompanied by Sarah Johnson for security assessment and Janet Mills for emergency coordination expertise. We'd meet at a highway rest stop that allowed for easy escape routes if the encounter went badly. Preparing for the meeting required planning for multiple scenarios. Best case, we'd establish productive relationships with allies who could help us address long-term survival challenges. Worst case, we'd be walking into a trap set by people who wanted to exploit or eliminate potential competition. Most likely, we'd encounter people who were dealing with the same problems we faced and trying to find solutions through cooperation or coercion. The journey to the meeting location took us through parts of Atlanta we hadn't seen since the freeze began. The devastation was more extensive than we'd realized. Entire neighborhoods had been abandoned, with houses showing evidence of hasty evacuation or structural damage from rapid temperature changes. Shopping centers were dark and empty, their parking lots filled with abandoned vehicles and scattered debris. But we also saw signs of organized survival activity. smoke rising from chimneys in residential areas where people had apparently barricaded themselves into individual homes. Roadblocks and defensive positions that suggested territorial control by organized groups. Gardens and greenhouses that had been hastily constructed to protect growing food from the cold. The Peachtree Alliance representatives were already waiting when we arrived at the rest stop. 3 vehicles, 8 people, and enough visible weapons to make their capabilities clear without being overtly threatening. Colonel Wright was exactly what his radio voice had suggested, a middle-aged man with military bearing who spoke in precise formal language. But the other members of his delegation were more diverse than I'd expected. A woman who introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Chen, apparently a former CDC researcher who'd been working on climate adaptation strategies. A man named Robert Hayes, who claimed to represent agricultural communities in the northern suburbs. Several others who seemed to have technical or administrative backgrounds rather than military experience. The conversation began with information sharing about conditions in different parts of the metropolitan area. The Peachtree Alliance controlled several communities in the northern suburbs, with a total population of over 300 people. They'd established defensive positions, organized resource sharing, and maintained contact with survivor groups as far north as Gainesville and as far east as Athens. Their reports confirmed that federal authorities had completely withdrawn from the region. Military installations had been evacuated, government offices had been closed indefinitely, and emergency services had been suspended for all non-essential areas. The Atlanta metropolitan area, along with most of Georgia, had been officially classified as a disaster zone with no timeline for recovery assistance. But the Alliance had also been in contact with survivor communities in other states, and the situation was similar across the entire southeast region. Federal resources were being concentrated in areas deemed strategically essential, primarily military installations and major industrial centers. Civilian populations were expected to manage independently or migrate to designated refugee centers that were reportedly overcrowded and undersupplied. Colonel Wright's proposal was straightforward. The Alliance wanted to establish a confederation of survivor communities that could coordinate defense, resource sharing, and long-term planning. Each community would maintain internal autonomy, but contribute to collective security and mutual aid programs. The goal was to create a regional organization capable of functioning independently until normal government services could be restored. The proposal sounded reasonable, but I was concerned about the power dynamics it implied. The Alliance was the largest and most militarized group in the region, which meant they would inevitably dominate any confederation they joined. Our community's valuable resources and strategic location would make us attractive partners, but they might also make us targets if cooperation wasn't forthcoming. Dr. Chen seemed to understand my concerns and addressed them directly. The Alliance wasn't interested in conquest or control, she said. They were interested in survival and mutual prosperity. The volcanic winter could last for years, and no single community had the resources or skills to manage all the challenges they would face. Cooperation was essential for everyone's long-term survival, but when I asked about specific governance structures and resource allocation mechanisms, the answers became vaguer. The Alliance leadership would coordinate regional planning, but local communities would implement their own policies. Resources would be shared based on need and availability, but contributing communities would have priority access. Defense would be provided collectively, but communities that couldn't contribute military resources would need to provide other forms of support. The meeting lasted for over 2 hours, and by the end I had a clear picture of what the Alliance represented. They were well-organized, well-armed, and apparently sincere about wanting to build a cooperative network of survivor communities. But they were also positioning themselves as the dominant power in the region, and their offers of cooperation came with implicit expectations of subordination. Sarah Johnson's security assessment was even more concerned than mine. The Alliance had military discipline, professional equipment, and strategic thinking that suggested significant pre-planning. Either they'd been preparing for this kind of disaster long before it occurred, or they had access to resources and personnel that most civilian groups lacked. Janet Mills was more optimistic about the cooperation possibilities but agreed that we needed to understand the Alliance's true capabilities and intentions before making any commitments. The offer to join their confederation might be genuine, but it might also be a way to identify and control potentially troublesome communities. The return journey to Brookhaven Elementary gave us time to process what we'd learned and develop our recommendations for the community. The Alliance represented both an opportunity and a threat. An opportunity because they offered protection, resources, and coordination that we couldn't achieve independently. A threat because joining their confederation might compromise our community's autonomy and decision-making authority. The evening community meeting to discuss the Alliance proposal was our most contentious debate yet. People who were primarily concerned about security supported joining the Confederation for protection against external threats. People who valued independence worried about subordinating our community to outside control. Others were concerned about the resource obligations and military commitments that membership might require. Dr. Martinez raised medical concerns about the Alliance's capabilities. If they were coordinating multiple communities across a large geographic area, they might also be facilitating the spread of infectious diseases. Large-scale cooperation could improve access to medical care, but it could also create vectors for disease transmission that smaller, isolated communities could avoid. Carl Washington was interested in the technical cooperation possibilities. Our community had valuable skills and resources, but we lacked expertise in areas like large-scale food production, renewable energy systems, and advanced manufacturing. A confederation of communities could pool knowledge and resources to solve problems that individual groups couldn't address. Maria Santos was concerned about educational and social development issues. Our community included dozens of children who needed structured learning opportunities and social interaction with peers. Isolation might be safer in the short term, but it could be harmful for long-term child development and community sustainability. The debate continued past midnight, but no consensus emerged. The Alliance proposal was too important to decide hastily, but delaying a decision also carried risks. Other communities were apparently joining the Confederation, which meant we might be excluded from regional cooperation networks if we waited too long to participate. I suggested a compromise approach that bought us time while preserving our options. We would maintain regular communication with the Alliance and participate in information-sharing activities. We would contribute to mutual aid efforts when our resources allowed, but we would not make formal commitments to the Confederation until we had more experience with their actual operations rather than just their stated policies. Wednesday morning brought validation of our cautious approach. Marcus Webb intercepted radio communications between Alliance communities that revealed significant tensions within their confederation. Communities were arguing about resource allocation, questioning military leadership decisions, and complaining about obligations they hadn't understood when they joined. The intercept suggested that the Alliance was struggling with exactly the kind of governance problems we'd been concerned about. Larger communities were dominating smaller ones, military priorities were overriding civilian needs, and promised benefits weren't being delivered as quickly as expected. Several communities were apparently considering withdrawal from the Confederation. More disturbing was evidence that the Alliance was using intimidation tactics against communities that refused to join their network. Economic pressure, territorial encroachment, and threats of exclusion from trade relationships. They weren't forcing cooperation through direct military action, but they were making independence increasingly difficult and expensive. The intelligence reinforced our decision to maintain autonomy while building selective relationships with other communities. We needed allies and trading partners, but we didn't need to surrender our decision-making authority to achieve those benefits. Wednesday afternoon brought another external challenge that tested our community's capabilities. A group of refugees from downtown Atlanta arrived at our school, having walked over 15 miles through frozen streets to reach what they'd heard was a safe community with medical care and warm shelter. The group included 23 people, ranging from young children to elderly adults. They'd been living in an abandoned office building without adequate heat or medical care. Several were showing signs of frostbite, malnutrition, and respiratory problems from prolonged exposure to volcanic ash. They were desperate, exhausted, and completely dependent on our willingness to help them. The arrival forced us to confront fundamental questions about our community's identity and obligations. We had resources to help these people, but doing so would strain our food supplies, medical capabilities, and housing capacity. We'd been planning for steady-state operations with our current population, not for continued growth through refugee absorption. But these were people who would die without assistance, and our community included medical professionals who'd taken oaths to preserve life whenever possible. Dr. Martinez and Patricia immediately began treating the most serious medical cases, but they also made it clear that comprehensive care would require resources we hadn't budgeted for expanded population. The debate about refugee admission revealed different perspectives on community membership and mutual obligation. Some people argued that we had moral responsibilities to help anyone who needed assistance. Others contended that our primary obligation was to the people who'd already committed to our community's survival. I found myself advocating for selective admission based on our capacity to provide effective assistance. We should help people who were in immediate medical danger, but we couldn't commit to indefinite support for everyone who sought shelter. We needed policies that balanced humanitarian concerns with resource sustainability. The compromise solution was to provide immediate medical care and temporary shelter, while helping the refugees connect with other communities that might have better capacity to support them long-term. We demonstrated our willingness to help people in emergency situations, but we'd also preserved our community's long-term viability. The refugee situation also highlighted the need for better regional coordination and information sharing. If we'd known about the office building group earlier, we might have been able to help them before their situation became so desperate. If other communities had better information about refugee populations, we might have been able to coordinate more effective assistance. Thursday morning brought news that changed our understanding of the broader disaster timeline. Marcus Webb had been monitoring international communications, and reports from Europe and Asia indicated that the volcanic winter effects were more severe and longer-lasting than anyone had initially predicted. Agricultural production in the Northern Hemisphere had essentially stopped. Grain harvests were failing completely, livestock was dying from cold and lack of feed, and food distribution systems were collapsing under the strain of unprecedented demand and supply shortages. Countries that had been food exporters were implementing strict rationing and export bans to preserve domestic supplies. The implications for our long-term survival were enormous. Even if we managed to survive the immediate cold weather challenges, we'd be facing years of food scarcity that could make our current problems seem minor by comparison. We needed to start thinking about sustainable food production strategies that could function under volcanic winter conditions. Dr. Chen's agricultural knowledge gained through our discussions with the Peachtree Alliance suddenly seemed much more valuable. Growing food in reduced sunlight conditions required specialized techniques, protected growing environments, and seed varieties that most civilian communities lacked. The technical cooperation benefits of joining a larger organization were becoming more attractive as the long-term challenges became clearer. But the international reports also reinforced our concerns about large-scale organization. Countries with centralized resource management were experiencing more severe social unrest than those that had devolved decision-making to local communities. Authoritarian responses to the crisis were creating more problems than they solved. While flexible, adaptive approaches were achieving better outcomes. The lesson seemed to be that survival required community-level organization and regional cooperation, but not necessarily submission to centralized authority. We needed to find ways to benefit from coordination and resource sharing without sacrificing the autonomy that allowed us to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Thursday evening brought our most serious security challenge yet. Sarah Johnson's security team detected armed individuals conducting surveillance of our school from multiple positions around the perimeter. The surveillance was professional and persistent, suggesting that someone was gathering intelligence for potential action against our community. The timing wasn't coincidental. Our refusal to join the Peachtree Alliance, our successful refugee assistance program, and our obvious prosperity compared to other communities in the area had apparently attracted unwanted attention. Someone was evaluating our defenses and resources, possibly as a prelude to demands or direct action. The security briefing was sobering. We had defensible positions and adequate weapons for our current population, but we weren't prepared for sustained conflict with a larger, better-armed force. Our community's strengths were cooperation, resource management, and technical expertise, not military capabilities. But we also had advantages that potential attackers might not fully appreciate. Our building was well fortified and easily defended. Our communication capabilities allowed us to coordinate with potential allies. Most importantly, our community cohesion and shared commitment to survival created motivation that purely extractive groups often lacked. The response plan balanced defensive preparation with diplomatic outreach. We'd strengthen our security protocols and prepare for potential conflict, but we'd also communicate our willingness to cooperate with reasonable neighbors and our determination to defend against unreasonable demands. Friday morning would bring the confrontation that would determine whether our community survived as an independent entity or became subordinate to larger, more aggressive organizations. The choices we'd made over the past week had positioned us well for the challenges ahead, but they'd also made us visible to people who might see us as competitors rather than potential allies. The volcanic winter was only beginning, and we were about to learn whether our approach to survival could withstand not just environmental challenges, but human ones as well. Friday morning, July 22nd, began with the confrontation we'd been anticipating since Thursday evening's surveillance detection. At dawn, approximately 30 armed individuals positioned themselves around Brookhaven Elementary School in what was clearly a coordinated operation designed to prevent escape or outside assistance. They weren't hiding their presence anymore, which meant they were confident enough in their capabilities to move from reconnaissance to direct action. The leader identified himself through a megaphone as Captain Reynolds from the Peachtree Alliance Security Division. His message was polite, but unambiguous. Our community had been classified as a regional security risk due to our refusal to participate in coordinated defense efforts and our harboring of unregistered refugees. We had 2 hours to accept Alliance protection and governance, or face the consequences of continued non-compliance. The ultimatum was exactly what we'd feared when we first encountered the Alliance representatives. What had been presented as voluntary cooperation was revealed as mandatory submission backed by military force. Communities that wouldn't join willingly would be compelled to join or eliminated as potential threats to regional stability. Sarah Johnson's security assessment was grimly realistic. We were outnumbered and outgunned by professional personnel who'd clearly planned this operation carefully. Our defensive positions were good enough to make a direct assault expensive, but not good enough to prevent a determined attack from succeeding eventually. Fighting would likely result in casualties we couldn't afford, and might not prevent the outcome the Alliance wanted. But surrender carried its own risks. Once we accepted Alliance authority, our community's autonomy would be completely compromised. Our resources would be allocated according to Alliance priorities, our people would be subject to Alliance discipline, and our decision-making processes would be subordinated to Alliance commands. We'd become a satellite community rather than an independent entity. The emergency community meeting was our most difficult debate yet, but it was also our most focused. We had less than 2 hours to make a decision that would determine our community's future, and there was no time for extended, philosophical discussions about independence versus security. We needed to evaluate our realistic options and choose the course of action most likely to preserve our people's survival and well-being. Maria Santos argued that resistance was futile and potentially catastrophic. The Alliance had superior force, and fighting would almost certainly result in deaths among community members who trusted us to make decisions that protected their safety. Accepting Alliance authority might compromise our autonomy, but it would preserve our lives and allow us to continue functioning as a community. Dr. Martinez was concerned about the medical implications of both resistance and surrender. Fighting would certainly produce casualties that would strain our already limited medical resources. But submitting to Alliance authority might also compromise our ability to provide medical care, according to our own standards and priorities. Alliance communities were apparently experiencing disease outbreaks and resource shortages that we'd managed to avoid. Carl Washington focused on the technical aspects of Alliance integration. Our community had valuable infrastructure and expertise that the Alliance clearly wanted to exploit. Surrender might preserve our people's lives, but it would also transfer our resources to an organization that hadn't invested in developing them. We'd become a source of wealth for other people rather than masters of our own prosperity. I found myself arguing for a third option that might preserve both our community's survival and its autonomy. Instead of choosing between resistance and surrender, we could propose a negotiated settlement that gave the Alliance some of what they wanted while preserving our essential independence. Tribute payments, technical cooperation, and limited integration that satisfied their security concerns without completely subordinating our decision-making authority. The debate was intense but brief. People understood the stakes and the time constraints. The final vote was close but decisive. We would attempt to negotiate a compromise solution that preserved our community's core identity while acknowledging the Alliance's regional authority. If negotiation failed, we would fight rather than surrender unconditionally. The decision reflected our community's fundamental values and the lessons we'd learned over the past 10 days. We valued cooperation and mutual aid, but we also valued independence and self-determination. We were willing to make sacrifices for survival, but not willing to sacrifice everything that made survival meaningful. Sarah Johnson and I approached the Alliance perimeter under a white flag to request direct negotiations with Captain Reynolds. The walk across the school parking lot was one of the longest 100 yards of my life, but it was necessary to demonstrate our willingness to engage, in good faith while making clear that we wouldn't be intimidated into immediate surrender. Captain Reynolds was exactly what I'd expected from his radio communications. Professional, disciplined, and absolutely convinced that Alliance authority was both legitimate and necessary for regional stability. He listened politely to our proposal for negotiated settlement, but his response made clear that compromise wasn't really an option from his perspective. The Alliance needed complete control of regional resources and population to manage the long-term challenges of volcanic winter survival, he explained. Independent communities created security risks, resource inefficiencies, and coordination problems that endangered everyone's survival. Our community's technical capabilities and strategic location made us too valuable to remain outside Alliance authority. But he was also pragmatic enough to understand that forced integration was more expensive and less effective than voluntary cooperation. If we were willing to accept Alliance governance while maintaining our community's internal organization, the transition could be managed smoothly and with minimal disruption to our current operations. The offer was more generous than I'd expected, but it was still fundamentally unacceptable. Alliance governance meant Alliance priorities, Alliance resource allocation, and Alliance discipline. Our community would survive physically, but it would cease to exist as an independent entity, capable of making its own decisions about its own future. I requested 1 hour to present the Alliance offer to our community and receive their formal response. Captain Reynolds agreed, but made clear that this was the final opportunity for negotiated settlement. If we rejected Alliance authority after this discussion, they would proceed with mandatory integration through whatever means proved necessary. The walk back to the school building was even more tense than the initial approach. Our community's fate now depended on a decision that had to be made quickly under extreme pressure. We had to choose between certain subordination and probable destruction, with no good options and no time to develop better alternatives. The final community vote was unanimous. We would reject Alliance authority and defend our independence regardless of the consequences. The decision wasn't based on calculations about military success or failure. It was based on our collective judgment that submission to Alliance control would destroy everything we'd built together, even if resistance might destroy us physically. The vote reflected 10 days of shared experiences that had forged our random collection of individuals into a genuine community. We'd made difficult decisions together, shared resources fairly, and developed trust that extended beyond immediate self-interest. What we'd built was worth defending, even against overwhelming odds. But the vote also reflected our understanding of the broader implications of the Alliance's regional consolidation efforts. If independent communities were eliminated or subordinated, the surviving population would be organized according to military priorities and authoritarian principles. The kind of society that emerged from volcanic winter would be determined by the kind of communities that survived it. I returned to Captain Reynolds with our community's formal rejection of Alliance authority. His response was professional disappointment rather than surprise or anger. He'd apparently expected our decision and had already prepared for the next phase of operations. We had until sunset to reconsider our position, after which the Alliance would implement mandatory integration procedures. The afternoon was spent in frantic preparation for siege conditions. We moved essential supplies to the most defensible areas of the school building, established communication protocols with potential outside allies, and organized our limited weapons and ammunition for maximum defensive effectiveness. Everyone understood that we were probably going to die, but everyone also understood why the sacrifice was necessary. Dr. Martinez and Patricia prepared medical supplies for treating combat casualties, knowing that our limited resources would be quickly overwhelmed if the fighting became intense. Marcus Webb established emergency radio communications to document what happened to our community and warn other independent groups about Alliance tactics. Maria Santos organized the children and elderly in the safest areas of the building. But the most important preparation was psychological. We spent the afternoon talking about what we'd accomplished together, what we'd learned about survival and cooperation, and what we hoped our example might mean for other communities facing similar challenges. The conversation wasn't morbid or despairing. It was celebratory of what we'd achieved and determined about what we were defending. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, our defensive preparations were interrupted by an unexpected radio communication. The ham radio operator in Birmingham, who'd been coordinating information sharing among Southeast survivor communities, was broadcasting an emergency alert about Alliance activities across the region. Multiple independent communities were under simultaneous attack by Alliance forces, apparently as part of a coordinated campaign to eliminate non-compliant groups before winter weather made military operations more difficult. But the attacks were also triggering resistance and mutual aid responses that the Alliance hadn't anticipated. Communities that had been maintaining loose contact were now forming explicit defensive alliances. Technical specialists were sharing information about improvised weapons and defensive strategies. Most importantly, Alliance defectors were providing intelligence about operational plans and resource limitations that made resistance more viable. The intelligence was encouraging, but it was also sobering. Our community was part of a much larger conflict between centralized and decentralized approaches to survival. The outcome of that conflict would determine whether the post-volcanic winter society was organized around cooperation or coercion, community autonomy, or military authority. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we received direct military assistance from an unexpected source. A group of 12 former military personnel who'd been traveling between survivor communities arrived at our location with better weapons, professional training, and detailed intelligence about Alliance capabilities and tactics. The group was led by Master Sergeant Elizabeth Torres, a career soldier who'd been discharged from federal service when her unit was deactivated during the post-eruption military reorganization. She and her team had been investigating Alliance operations for several weeks and had concluded that they represented a serious threat to civilian survivor communities across the Southeast. Sergeant Torres's intelligence was disturbing but useful. The Alliance wasn't just a regional organization that had emerged spontaneously after the volcanic eruption. It was connected to federal military units that had been tasked with population management and resource control during the emergency. What appeared to be civilian community cooperation was actually military occupation disguised as mutual aid. The revelation explained several aspects of Alliance operations that had seemed suspicious. Their professional organization, advanced equipment, and strategic planning weren't products of exceptional civilian leadership. They were products of military training and federal resources that had been redirected from official channels to unofficial operations. But Sergeant Torres also brought tactical knowledge that significantly improved our defensive capabilities, proper positioning of weapons and personnel, communication protocols that were harder to intercept, and improvised defensive measures that could multiply our effectiveness against numerically superior forces. Most importantly, she brought confirmation that our resistance wasn't futile, The alliance was strong enough to overwhelm individual communities, but it was also overextended across a large geographic area with limited resources and growing opposition. Effective resistance by multiple communities could disrupt their operations and force them to choose between consolidation and expansion. The tactical briefing was completed just as the Alliance ultimatum expired at sunset. Captain Reynolds contacted us by radio to request our final decision, apparently still hoping to avoid the costs and complications of forced integration. But his tone had changed from confidence to concern, suggesting that he was also receiving reports about resistance activities in other locations. Our response was brief and unambiguous. We rejected Alliance authority and would defend our community's independence. We were prepared for whatever consequences that decision entailed, but we would not surrender our autonomy to avoid them. The Alliance response was immediate and overwhelming. Instead of the gradual escalation we'd expected, they launched a coordinated assault designed to capture the school building quickly, before our defensive preparations could prove effective. Professional tactics, superior weapons, and numerical advantage that should have ended our resistance within minutes. But Sergeant Torres's tactical guidance and our community's determination proved more effective than anyone had anticipated. The Alliance assault was slowed by defensive measures they hadn't expected and harassed by resistance tactics that disrupted their coordination. What should have been a quick victory became a prolonged battle that attracted attention from other communities and potential allies. The fighting lasted through the night, with Alliance forces gradually gaining control of the school perimeter, while our community maintained control of the main building. Casualties were significant on both sides, but our medical team managed to keep our wounded alive and fighting while Alliance forces had to evacuate their casualties for treatment elsewhere. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the tactical situation changed dramatically. Other survivor communities that had been monitoring our radio communications began arriving to provide assistance. Not organized military support, but civilian. Volunteers who decided that our resistance represented something worth defending. The arrival of outside assistance turned our desperate last stand into something that looked like actual victory. Alliance forces found themselves outnumbered and facing coordinated resistance from multiple communities that were working together for the first time. Captain Reynolds's tactical advantage evaporated as his forces were surrounded by people who were fighting for their homes rather than following orders. By dawn on Saturday, July 23rd, the Alliance forces had withdrawn from our immediate area. Not defeated, but unable to complete their mission without casualties and complications that exceeded their operational parameters. We'd won a battle, but the war for regional control was just beginning. The victory celebration was muted by the costs we'd paid and the challenges that remained ahead. We'd lost people we cared about, spent resources we couldn't easily replace, and attracted attention that would make future Alliance retaliation inevitable. But we'd also demonstrated that resistance was possible and inspired other communities to organize their own defenses. Most importantly, we'd established the principle that survival didn't require submission to military authority or abandonment of community autonomy. Independent communities could work together effectively without surrendering their independence to centralized control. Cooperation was possible without coercion, and mutual aid could be organized without military command structures. The aftermath of our successful defense brought new opportunities and new responsibilities. Communities across the region were requesting assistance with their own defensive preparations. Technical specialists were sharing information about weapons, tactics, and organizational strategies. A genuine network of independent communities was emerging to balance the Alliance's centralized approach to regional control. But we were also facing the long-term implications of choosing resistance over submission. The Alliance would almost certainly return with greater force and better preparation. Winter weather would make both defensive and offensive operations more difficult. Most importantly, the conflict was consuming resources and attention that should have been focused on survival and community building. The choice we'd made to fight for our independence was the right choice, but it was also the beginning of much larger and more complex challenges that would test everything we'd learned about survival, cooperation, and community resilience during the first 2 weeks of the volcanic winter that was reshaping our world.